Welcome to Sounds of Brass.
All in a Day's Work, 30 Years as a Local Bobby, by Chris Helme.
Chapter 9. A Near Riot. It was June 1975 when I finally started at Brighouse. It was a steady 9-5 first day, with an instruction to parade outside the superintendent's office at 9 a.m. sharp. The meeting lasted all of 5 minutes, and on first impressions I felt that he was not someone I was going to like. I suppose whether I was going to like my transfer to Brighouse or not really depended on whether he was going to take to me, rather than whether or not I liked him. I had no way of knowing that he was the first of 6 superintendents I would see come and go at Brighouse over the next 26 years. I gradually got to like him, and in policing terms he never caused me any problems, although if I had been a beat car driver it might have been different. The superintendent's office overlooked the road from the town centre leading down to the police station, and his desk was positioned so that he could see every police vehicle that came in or out. Any officer who he saw driving a police car without the police issue cap was immediately sent for, even if its blue lights were flashing for an emergency call-out. Once the emergency was dealt with, the driver had to immediately return to the police station and see the superintendent to explain why they were not wearing any headgear. While most had just forgotten in the haste to get away, they all received his familiar steely-eyed look of disapproval and a bawling out. One officer had a legitimate excuse. He was 6 feet 5 inches tall, and he had to lay almost horizontally in the car to drive it around, even without the cap. But no, not even his excuse washed with the superintendent. However, I have to thank him for my appointment to the post of community constable for the Smith House estate, and ultimately for the whole of Lightcliffe. I will always be grateful for his decision, which would change my life. After that initial meeting, I then had to see my new shift sergeant, whose appearance reminded me of the inspector that had visited me when I was ill in Leeds. He introduced himself and greeted me by saying, "Don't be bringing Bradford policing habits here." If that was the traditional welcome he gave to everyone who came to work at Brighouse, I could see that he and I would never hit it off. It would take time to adjust to my new colleagues and supervisors, but within a couple of weeks I was going home so disillusioned that I wished I could just turn the clock back to working in Wyke and Low Moor again. In those first few weeks I was told I had to work with someone who knew the area, a PC whom the sergeant described as an experienced officer, and someone who would show me around. I didn't tell the sergeant that I was born and brought up in Brighouse, nor that I probably knew the town and all its satellite communities better than he did. Having lived here all my life, it was likely that I also knew more people living in the subdivision than anyone else working in the station. I was teamed up with a young lad called Howard, who had worked in Brighouse for all of 8 months, and we got on very well. Howard explained the who's who at the police station, and in particular who to watch out for and the ones not to cross. It soon became apparent that the shift sergeant had his favourites, which I suppose was his small clique, a group that I never wanted to be part of and never would be. After telling Howard that I was brought up in Brighouse, he suggested that I better show him around. While I showed him parts of the town he was not familiar with, he showed me the different forms and paperwork we had to use, and how to present them. Even though a statement was a statement, the sergeant insisted that we had to write them his way, the Old West Riding way. The turning point in those first few weeks came following an incident involving a member of the sergeant's clique. This incident shocked me. I had never seen anything like it before in my short policing career in Leeds or Bradford. If this was how things were dealt with on this shift and at this police station, I certainly did not want to be associated with it. What I saw gave me serious thoughts about immediately applying for a transfer out of Brighouse. I was working half nights, and as Howard was working all night, we were teamed up until it was time for me to go off at 2 a.m. We were coasting around the town centre, showing our presence just as the pubs were closing, when we received an urgent message. Control to 3539. Can you both go to the Hartshead Moor motorway service area as quickly as possible, because some wagon drivers have caught a lad red-handed stealing property from under a wagon sheet, and another lad has run away. 10-4, I said, and with blue lights flashing, we were on our way. Hartshead Moor service area was the first service area to be built on the Yorkshire section of the M62. It was between junctions 25 and 26 and was opened in 1973. It was built with a restaurant on both sides of the motorway, with a connecting footbridge spanning across the road. On the day it opened, the whole site covered an area of 32 acres and had parking facilities for 346 cars, 161 wagons and 15 coaches. The motorway at Brighouse was part of the 7.5 million Hartshead to Gildersham section of the M62, junctions 25 to 27, and was started on the 1st of June 1970. It was due to be completed by the 31st of December 1972. However, the work was successfully completed 3 months ahead of schedule. Over the years, Hartshead Moor service area would become my second home, particularly on Saturdays, as part of a weekly football duty ritual. Pitch battles between rival football supporters were commonplace at many service areas, and Hartshead was no exception. The largest number of coaches visiting Hartshead was reported to be 108 on one Saturday, which meant that approximately 5,570 passengers were using the facilities on the site. With many of them buying something, it was no wonder that the management put up with the trouble some of the visiting fans caused. On February the 4th, 1974, almost 18 months before my transfer to Brighouse, the service area became the centre of an international news story when a bomb was detonated on a coach carrying British Army and RAF personnel. The incident happened shortly after midnight, while most of the passengers on board were asleep. 12 people were killed and many more were injured. There is a memorial plaque in memory of those who were killed in the entrance hall of the westbound section of the service area, which was used as a first aid station for those wounded in the blast. In 1983, the action of one of our sergeants caused a near riot very late one night in the restaurant. This was Saturday, January the 8th, the night of the Embassy Professional Darts Championship final between Eric the crafty Cockney Bristow and the unseeded challenger Keith the fella Della. One of the cars picked me up. We drove up to Hartshead, and after doing a few circuits round the vehicle parks, we then went into the restaurant for a cup of tea. To our amazement, the restaurant was packed with dozens of wagon drivers, town centre taxi drivers, and some of the motorway police, the other town centre beat car, and all the service area staff. Everyone was glued to the spot, watching the nail-biting darts final on the television. Bristow was on the verge of going out, with Della steaming ahead, when one of the Brighouse sergeants walked in, looked around at the unexpected number of people in the restaurant. Every throw by Keith Della received rousing cheers, while Eric Bristow received loud groans of disappointment. Keith Della stormed towards the final checkout. The whole place was on edge. Could Bristow get back in, or would the rank outsider, Della, manage to pull off the biggest upset in world darts? The atmosphere was electric. Everybody was on the edge of their seats, biting their fingernails. The gradual crescendo of cheering and groans from the excited onlookers got even louder. With little more than a few minutes to go, the sergeant walked up to the television and said, "That's it, you're all making too much noise." He promptly pulled the plug out, leaving a stunned audience jeering, swearing, and shouting to get it back on. I am sure that if it had been another time and place in history, he could quite easily have been lynched. I saw the sergeant nonchalantly walking towards the exit slope and front door, just as the television came back on. But it was too late. The match was all over, and Keith Deller had won 6-5 to become the 1983 Embassy Professional Darts Champion. What a time we had, taking all the flack from what was clearly a big crowd of irate wagon drivers. We couldn't get out of the place fast enough. That night was still a few years away yet. With our blue lights flashing, Howard got us to the service area, and as we arrived we were mobbed by a large crowd of wagon drivers. They were all trying to talk at once about the lads who had been stealing from some of the wagons. Howard sent me inside to look after the lad some of the wagon drivers had caught. It was obvious that a few of the drivers were so angry that he was in danger of getting a right thumping. As Howard went off to the wagon park, I quickly went up to the restaurant, where some of the drivers were guarding the lad and ensuring he would not run away. The two of us were now surrounded by wagon drivers who were all trying to shout at us at the same time. With a little bit of encouragement, they left the two of us together. I ascertained that he was called Brian, and I tried to calm him down. He was obviously scared and intimidated by the drivers. He was almost crying. "It weren't just me," he said, very nervously. "Just me what? Them wagon drivers chased. Who's the lad the others are looking for?" "I don't know. I just know him as Kiddo from Elland." Howard walked into the restaurant with some more of the drivers, who were obviously still wound up about what had happened. "Howard," I said, "we'd better leave. If they get hold of this lad, he's going to get hurt." We arrived back at the station, having made arrangements for some of the drivers to hang on until someone came back to take statements and find out just what had gone on. As we walked through the back door of the police station, we were greeted by the sergeant, who asked what had happened. Howard went off with the sergeant to his office to explain the situation. I was sat in the detention room with the lad when suddenly the door burst open, swinging and hitting the back wall. It was one of the sergeant's clique, Charlie Walker, a PC with around 20 years' service, and not someone I particularly liked. "Has he told you who the other lad was?" he asked. "It's a lad from Elland. We don't know his proper name yet, just his nickname, Kiddo. One of the lads at Elland Nick should know who it is." It was now running up to 2 a.m. and time for me to go off duty. I checked with the sergeant if it was okay for me to go home, and I left the lad with Charlie. I was not needed, so I returned to the detention room to tell Charlie I was off home, and that he would have to watch Brian until they decided what was to happen to him. I was back for my 10 a.m. 6 p.m. duty the following day. I signed in and noticed that the lad from the night before was still shown as being at the station. I went into the detention room and saw that the lad had obviously been beaten up. He recognised me, and he was obviously still very distressed. "What's happened to you?" I asked. "It was that other policeman. After you had gone, he asked me the other lad's name, and I told him the same as I told you." "But who was beating you up?" "He did, because he wanted the other lad's name, but he wouldn't believe me." "Right," I said. "The policeman's name is Charlie Walker. When this is all over, you must complain about what he has done." I don't think he ever did complain, because I never heard about it again. I did mention it to Charlie, but he seemed to think it was funny. His attitude and bully boy method left me cold. Should I ask for a transfer, or stick it out? I decided to stay, but to get off that sergeant's shift as soon as I could. As for Charlie the bully Walker, I never spoke to him again, and I made sure I never worked with him through choice either. I also warned every new face at the station what he was like, and not to guarantee that his friend the sergeant would do anything if Charlie did it again. As the weeks went by and I was still looking for a move to another shift, I heard that the community constable who worked at the hilltop village of Clifton wanted a change, and had asked to come off that beat. That was easier said than done, because the community constable role was still a fairly new concept. The chief constable wanted these officers to stay and build up working partnerships with their communities, very much in the way the old-time local bobbies did. The community constable was really just a modern revival of the old village bobby. The Brighouse area had 5 community constables, and the rule was that if one came off, a replacement had to be appointed to maintain the level of 5 officers. This was my opportunity to finally get the job I wanted. Instead of applying for the now vacant Clifton post, I suggested that, in the absence of a community constable on the Smith House estate, consideration should be given to discontinuing the Clifton post and creating a new one for Smith House. I put my report into the sergeant straight away, but his immediate response was, "You've got no chance. You've only been here 10 minutes. I found out that only one other person had applied for the job, and he was one of the clique. No doubt he would be receiving a favourable and supportive report from his friend the sergeant. A few days later, the sergeant told me to go on parade outside the superintendent's office. He wanted to see me. The superintendent followed me down the corridor to his office and invited me in. "Sit down, PC Helme," he said. "I have received your application for the vacant community constable posting. You think a community constable at Smith House estate area would be better than one at Clifton?" "Yes, sir." "Right, you've got the job, but it's only on a trial basis, and I will be monitoring how you're doing." "Right, sir, thank you. When do I start?" "Now." My main aim was to bring back a little of the old-style policing that I grew up with on the estate. This was back in the old days of the local bobby, who I knew, respected, and was a little bit frightened of. Some of those officers were still living in the community, including retired PC Jack Butcher, who chased me up and down the estates more than once when I was a kid. Old habits die hard, because even many years into his retirement I could never call him by his first name. That was the way we were brought up in the 1950s, 60s and 70s. To me, he would always be Mr. Butcher. Who would ever have thought? Certainly none of those policemen of my childhood could have imagined it would be me who would succeed them as the local bobby. I wanted to get rid of the attitude that a policeman only visits a school when there was trouble. In my own school days, the moment a policeman set foot inside the school gate, it meant trouble for somebody. But my mother, and most other mothers I know, always told their offspring, "If you get lost, always find a policeman. He will help you." I think back to my days at Wyken Low Moor, remembering those words alongside the comments of other parents, telling their children that if they did not behave, then the same policeman would take them away. You can't have it both ways. These are very mixed messages, and very confusing for a child. The world is changing. The under-12s are the adults of tomorrow, and should be brought up to know the policeman is there to help, whether they have done something wrong or not. These young people see many things that just pass by the eyes of adults. While they may not necessarily understand what they have seen, under certain circumstances they can make very good eyewitnesses. For example, there was a 9-year-old lad and his mother who I sat with for over 2 hours. From his bedroom window, the young lad had seen a car drive up to another car and one of the occupants get out, before smashing the driver's side window of the other car and stealing some property. Could he describe the offender, the driver in the getaway car, or the make of the vehicle? No. But what he could do was draw a picture of the car, and he had also written down the registration number. Why? Because, like many other young boys, he collected car numbers. Both offenders later pleaded guilty in court. Young people must always be listened to, and their stories must not just be written off as fanciful. Working as the community constable meant that I could start and finish at home, work the shifts I felt were appropriate, but certainly not 9 to 5 every day, and have all the weekends off. Sometimes I had to cover the front counter while the office man had his meal break. Most people would imagine that it was one of the easiest jobs in the police service. Well, don't you believe it? The first time I worked at the front counter at Brighouse, the most important thing I learned was not to leave your overcoat out of sight for too long. I did it just once, and came back to discover that someone had taken the epaulets off my coat, switched it with theirs, and then replaced my epaulets onto their shabby old coat. These are supposed to be your workmates. In all the years I was asked to work at the front counter, I never took my coat off. I even always kept my helmet in view, and my issue black leather gloves were never out of sight. Once bitten, twice shy. During that first hour on the counter, I had a mixed bag of problems to deal with. The first was a man who must have been 6'7" and built like a tank. As my eyes climbed the young man's huge frame, I said, "Hello, can I help?" "Well, I hope you can," he said. "You see, it's our lad. He started stealing, and we just cannot get through to him that it's wrong, and now we are desperate. We could have a word with him, but can't his mother get through to him? Motherly talk and all that." "No, she's almost pulling her hair out with it, and we don't believe in smacking children." "I can understand that. Where do you live?" "Lightcliffe." "That's my beat. When would be a good time to see him? What time does he get home from work?" "Oh, he's not working yet." "OK, what about 4:30 after school? Would that be a good time?" "He doesn't go to school." "I will be careful about that situation," I said, "otherwise you'll have the education welfare lady chasing you." At this point 5 men came through the door. "I won't be a moment," I said to them. "Take a seat." I turned back to the man. "So where is your son now?" "He's here," he said, and lifted up a child of about 4 or 5 years old. Then the man sat him on the front of the counter. "This is the person you say is such a villain your wife is pulling her hair out, and all 6'7" of you can't parent a child of this age? Does he have a grandma?" "Yes." "Well, go and see her and ask for some parenting skills from someone who will have no difficulty in sorting this out with you. You don't need a sledgehammer to crack a peanut." "Thank you. Goodbye." I turned to the 5 men. "Sorry about that, gents. What's this, then? A deputation?" The 5 were managers from the Brighouse Co-op. "How can I help you?" "We have come to hand this gun in," they said, "and these bullets." I had never handled a real gun before. It looked very old. "Is it a real one?" I asked. "Of course it is," said the most senior-looking of the men. It transpired that during the 1920s, the chief cashier at the King Street Central branch had been issued with a gun and a box of live ammunition. This was only to be used in the event of a robbery and if any of the staff were threatened. The Co-op Board of Directors would support the chief cashier if he had to ever use it. "Has it ever been used?" I asked. "Apparently not, but what would I do with it now?" The sergeant was in his office, and he advised me to take possession of the gun, make sure there was no ammunition still in it, and give them a receipt. Then it was to go in the station safe. But what about the bullets? I was instructed to take them outside to the back of the police station, where there was a bucket filled with sand. I was to bury the bullets in the sand and then make arrangements for the gun and bullets to be collected. Traffic eventually came to collect them, but it was almost a week later. If that wasn't bad enough, leaving a number of live bullets outside in a bucket of sand, I heard a few weeks later the same sergeant told another officer to put a live grenade in the same bucket. By that time it was being stored near the diesel oil store at the side of the station. After an hour on the front counter, the office man returned, and I could finally go home after my first day as the new local bobby.
All in a Day's Work, 30 Years as a Local Bobby, by Chris Helme.
Chapter 10. Walking in the Footsteps of Giants. Not long after I started working on my new community beat, it was extended to include Stony Lane Estate, which meant I was now the local bobby on the same streets that I lived and played on as a child. Gradually, as the years went by, the size of my beat extended to include Bailiff Bridge, Lightcliffe, parts of Hipperholme, Norwood Green, and when there was no one else available, Hove Edge as well. My interest in local history started during the late 1970s, and it soon developed into a passion. Now, after almost 40 years and in my retirement from the police, I am still spreading the word through public speaking, writing, and teaching for anyone who wants to listen and learn about the local history of Brighouse and my community. The initial interest came about by chance from having to attend calls made to the police by elderly people who lived on the estates, with various complaints, usually about young people. With many of them living alone, reporting matters to the new local bobby made them feel better, whether I could actually do anything positive about it or not. I had known many of these people when I was living on the estate as a child. Back in my childhood days, it was a long-held tradition that children would refer to adult neighbours as auntie or uncle. In some quarters of my beat, I was called some names that could quite easily cause offence to other people, but not these old friends. They always referred to me as PC Helme, Chris, Bobby Helme, or Ronnie Helme's lad. Once they had shared their problem with me, and I suggested a possible cure, they were happy. Their hospitality was not far behind, with a cup of tea and maybe a wedge of Christmas cake. To change the subject from the often worrying problems they had experienced, I would ask them about their childhood days and the policemen of that time. They were only too pleased that someone was interested in their earlier lives, and their stories poured out. Gradually, through mutual respect and trust, many of these older residents became my eyes and ears, and they were happy to share things they had seen and heard that they thought I should know about. It was whilst talking to many of the older residents that the names of some of my predecessors would be brought into the conversation. I decided to try and research the history of my community beat and find out who my predecessors were and how far back in time I could go. To the casual visitor, my area straddled both sides of Wakefield Road on the A649, between the three villages of Bailiff Bridge, Lightcliffe and Hipperholme. It would take around 5 minutes to drive through. As a foot patrol officer, you view an area differently because you see more, and to walk from one end of the beat to the other could take as long as you wanted it to. I started at the bottom of the hill in Bailiff Bridge, where I saw the tragic aftermath of the runaway wagon in 1972. This village has had a long history connected to the carpet industry through the development of T.F. Firth's Carpet Manufacturing Company. Firth was opened in an old worsted mill in the heart of the village, after it was bought in 1867 at an auction in Halifax. For generations, its founder, Thomas Freeman Firth, employed his workers from almost every family in the village and the surrounding communities. The carpet mill was closed in December 2000, with all the remaining employees made redundant. It was a sad day, not just for the former employees, but also for the whole community. To many Bailiff Bridge residents, the company was always likened to a large extended family. A traditional occupation for many retired police officers and ex-military men was a mill security officer, and it was no different at Firth's. Before the First World War, a man who worked there was a certain Sergeant Simpson, an ex-soldier. If one of the mill workers was late, they would have the daunting task of having to face him. He would either give you a warning for being late, send you home, or have money docked from your wages. For those children who would be described as half-timers, half a day at school and half a day working at the mill, being sent home for lateness created a difficult week for the family income. The best-known chief security officer at the mill during my service was Edgar Clay, who was an old friend, and he helped me out of a scrape when I lost my truncheon. I had no idea where I'd lost it, and having looked in vain for weeks, I finally had to submit a report about it. A newly promoted chief inspector who had been appointed to Brighouse picked up the report and pounced. I was summoned to his office. Being new to our station, we expected this broom to sweep through the station very quickly to make an early impression. "PC Helme, your lost equipment report about your truncheon says you lost it several weeks ago. Are you admitting to parading for duty without all your required equipment for all that time?" Reading between the lines in his question, I said, "No, sir. I think I'll look a little bit harder. I should be able to find it." "See me at the end of the week," he said, "and bring it with you." I had no idea where it was, and I couldn't imagine where I was going to get one from. Short of taking one belonging to a workmate, not my kind of trick, I thought to myself. Then I had a brilliant idea, and I got back to Bailiff Bridge as quickly as possible. I called in at Firth's time office and saw Edgar. Explaining my predicament, I asked if he had a spare truncheon that his security staff did not carry any more. Problem solved. Edgar promptly handed me one and told me to keep it. The day finally arrived when I had to go and see the Chief Inspector again. Waiting outside his office, I looked at the truncheon and suddenly noticed the name T. F. Firth engraved in the wood. I dashed off to the cloakroom, found a matchbox, and scuffed up the lettering. I also found a tin of black boot polish and daubed some into the scuff marks, dusting it over. There was no time to knock when I returned to his office. He asked me in. At this point I must explain that he was a newly promoted Chief Inspector from Bradford, and he did not know one end of Brighouse from the other. "I've found the truncheon, sir," I said. "Show it to me." I produced a truncheon that had been given to me by Edgar Clay, and did my best to keep a straight face. "P.C. Helme, there is some writing on the side. Does it say Firth, perhaps? T. Firth?" "Yes, sir. When it was issued to me, I was told one of the previous officers who it belonged to was P.C. Trevor Firth from Bradford. You might remember him." No, I don't remember him. He handed me the lost equipment report and reminded me to look after my equipment in future. A close call. Not long after, the Chief Inspector was on his travels again and promoted to an even higher rank. I heard some fascinating stories about the history of my community beat, listening to some of the older residents. Following the redefining of Bradford city boundary in 1899, Bailiff Bridge was amalgamated from North Byerley in Bradford into the Hipperholme Urban District Council and became part of the Hipperholme Police Section. PCs Fawcett and Reynolds were two of the earliest local officers that older residents talked about. They talked about P.C. Fawcett because all of the children at Bailiff Bridge were scared of him, but P.C. Reynolds was the one all the children used to like. Many of the older people could remember him from their childhood days at Hipperholme Infant School, particularly when it was voting day. P.C. Tom Reynolds was always the policeman on duty at the Hipperholme Town Hall, which is now the Hipperholme Branch Library, where voting used to take place. Many of the children would dash down to the town hall entrance from the infant school to see Bobby Reynolds, as they all knew him, sitting back in a chair, talking to everyone who came to vote. The lucky children who got there first were given a few pence to fetch him an evening newspaper, and a bit extra to buy something from the sweet tray for their trouble. P.C. Reynolds had also served at Norwood Green in 1898, and was transferred to Hipperholme from there. He retired in 1919 on his 25-year police pension. He passed away in 1948 and was interred in Lightcliffe Old Cemetery. When a new policeman arrives to work in a small community, he is always compared with his predecessors, and he always will be. When I arrived on the scene, I often heard the following, particularly from older people: "You're not like Bobby Stennett, are you?" P.C. John Stennett was the Lightcliffe local bobby from the late 1940s until his retirement in 1951, and was someone who was very well respected in the community. He died in 1954, and he was interred in the Lightcliffe Old Cemetery, along with his wife, Marion, who died in 2004. Such comments about my predecessors highlighted the high esteem they were held in. Hearing people talk about them left you in no doubt that these police officers, along with the local doctors, district nurses, the local head teacher, and church ministers, were some of the giants in the community. Whilst I felt I could never compare myself to my predecessors, I had to do one thing they had done, and that was to get to know everyone quickly. Over the years, residents have often asked me how to spell bailiff. Was it with an E on the end, or without? The question arose because Bailiff Bridge Post Office has always been spelt without the E, but Bailiff Bridge School, some 500 yards away, is spelt with an E on the end. So which is the right one, and why has the E been lost? One of the reasons has often been said to be because the name was too long, and this caused difficulties when the first tram was to arrive from Brighouse in October of 1904. With the E, the name was just too long to show on the tram destination board, and in time it was decided to shorten it. Whether this story is true has been long lost in the midst of time, but it has a nice ring about it. Moving out of Bailiff Bridge, we climb the steep hill into Lightcliffe. This is the first problem. Where does Lightcliffe actually start? In days gone by, the people of Bailiff Bridge were quite happy to say, "It's top of Bailiff Hill, they're all toffee-nosed up there." To illustrate this comment, we can use an oft-quoted story from the district, often brought into conversation. This was when a rather well-to-do lady from Lightcliffe caught the tram from Brighouse to Bailiff Bridge. When the conductor requested her fare, she replied, "A single to Stomach Bridge, please." It appears that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many of the locals referred to the village simply as Belly Brig, but this well-to-do lady was too proud to use such common language. Walking up Wakefield Road towards Lightcliffe, for almost a century you would have had to pass the Bailiff Bridge Police House, with its familiar West Riding Constabulary metal plaque on the outside wall. The days of the police authorities owning houses for their personnel gradually came to an end from the 1970s. One of the first larger houses at the top of the hill in Lightcliffe is Helme House, the former home of Sir Algernon and Lady Janet Firth of the carpet mill. It is a house that once hosted two Prime Ministers. Lord Palmerston was Prime Minister between 1859 and 1865 and was invited to stay at Helme House by the owner, Sir H. W. Ripley, for his 3-day visit in 1864, when he laid the foundation stone at Bradford Wool Exchange Building. Herbert Asquith also stayed at Helme House whilst he was Prime Minister between 1912 and 1916. He was the MP for Morley and a cousin of Sir Algernon Firth. With these two high-profile visitors, no doubt the local police would have been on guard in Wakefield Road to ensure they came to no harm. Lightcliffe was part of the Hipperholme-cum-Brighouse township, with Hipperholme being the dominant of the two. The administration of the township was carried out at Bottom Hall Farm, Lightcliffe, which also served as the district workhouse. In 1635, Charles I granted Halifax a charter to set up a workhouse and established a managing committee known as the Master and Governors of the Workhouse for the Poor within the town and parish of Halifax. A parliamentary report of 1777 recorded a number of other local workhouses were in operation, including Elland with Greetland, Halifax, Midgley, Norland, Ovenden, North Aureham, South Aureham, Soyland, Stainland, Worley and Hipperholme-cum-Brighouse, which had 40 inmates. The earliest recorded parish constable I have found is Robtus Del Road, who was appointed for the Hipperholme-cum-Brighouse township in 1364. Prior to the West Riding Constabulary, the Guardians of the Peace consisted of constables annually chosen at the vestry meetings. The appointees were often the local landowner and received no payment for the position, just his expenses. This role will be a yearly appointment. In comparatively modern times, he would pay deputies to do the work now performed by police officers. From the early 18th century, Bottom Hall Farm was where the parish constable carried out his duties, until the Municipal Corporation Act of 1835 was enacted. This act set in motion what we now know as a local council and introduced the role of the mayor, the alderman and the councillors. It also saw the introduction of the Watch Committee, with one of its functions being to appoint properly fit men to be constables for boroughs and cities. This saw the Halifax and Huddersfield boroughs incorporated in 1848 and Dewsbury in 1862, and they formed their own police forces. The city area of Wakefield followed in 1862, Bradford in 1847 and Leeds in 1836. The Halifax Poor Law Union was formed on February the 10th, 1837, and was overseen by an elected Board of Guardians. On July the 27th, 1839, the board decided to erect a new workhouse for the Union on some land which had been bought between Gibbet Street and Hanson Lane in Halifax. The Poor Law Commissioners had reported that some of the township workhouses were not fit for human habitation. In 1840, all the paupers were removed from the old workhouses, including the one at Bottom Hall Farm, and they were sent to the new workhouse in Halifax. With the workhouse moving to Halifax, the Bottom Hall Farm workhouse and the township meeting room became redundant, with the property reverting back to a working farm. A new venue for the township meeting room was established at Harley Head in Hove Edge. The construction of the Manchester and Leeds Railway through Brighouse in 1840 resulted in many strangers and navvies coming into the town. There were reports of increased crime and other problems attributed to these people, and the business community wanted something to be done. As a result, an organisation called the Watchmen's Society was formed, with many of its members being the shopkeepers and tradesmen of the district. Funds to run the new organisation were achieved by subscriptions of 4p per week from the members. Their nominated substitutes had to take it in turns to parade and patrol the town, just as a police officer would do. This society was in operation until February the 17th, 1854, when a meeting was held at the township room at Harley Head in Hove Edge, with Mr. Thomas Sugden in the chair. The following resolution was passed: that a proper and efficient police officer be appointed for the township and to reside in Brighouse. He will devote all his time to the services of his office, and that he be paid a salary of £60 a year, and that he accounts for all fees he receives by virtue of his office. In addition, it is also approved that a constable be also appointed for the township to reside in Hipperholme, and that officer be paid a salary of £10 a year. It was also passed that a list of unpaid constables, which was submitted and numbered 50, be accepted. With the creation of the new borough and city police forces, this left a very large area which was not policed on a day-to-day basis. In 1853, the County and Borough Police Act made it mandatory for the county authorities to have a police service as well. The West Riding Constabulary was created in 1856, with the appointment of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Cobb as the first Chief Constable. With an authorised police strength of 466, by the following year he had 459 men posted in the newly created divisions. During the transition from parish constable to the Watchmen's Society to the early years of the new West Riding Constabulary, a number of officers served our local community, and would have been my predecessors. These guardians of the peace included Anthony Waddington, who was born in Hipperholme and was employed as a cordwainer. He died in 1862. The name of PC 341, William Greenwood, appears in the 1856 West Riding Constabulary Examinations book. He was 31 years old, born in South Aureham, and married with 6 children, and his entry in the book shows that he could read and write. His previous employment was 5 years' service in the Halifax Borough Police, which was formed in 1848. He also served for almost 3 years as the parish constable for the Hipperholme-cum-Brighouse township. He joined the new West Riding Constabulary on December 31st, 1856, as a constable, and this suggests he was the first constable in the West Riding Constabulary to serve as our local bobby. The examination book also shows that he was promoted to the rank of inspector on January the 6th, 1857, which would have led him to being posted elsewhere. One of the first sergeants to be appointed for Hipperholme-cum-Brighouse was Mark Greaves, who commenced his duties in April 1857. He had previously served as a constable on the Lincolnshire Railways and in the Hyde police force in Cheshire. On his appointment at Brighouse, the township of Hollingworth and Tintwistle presented him with £20 for his service to those communities. In 1866, the existence of the Hipperholme-cum-Brighouse township came to an end, with its formal separation. A Brighouse local board was established for the administration of the town, and in 1893 it was incorporated as a borough. With the local government changes in 1974, the borough of Brighouse became part of the new Calderdale Metropolitan Borough Council. As a result of a referendum in Hipperholme, it too established a local board in 1869, and, following the Local Government Act of 1894, Hipperholme became an urban district council. In 1937 it was amalgamated into the borough of Brighouse, having been the dominant partner in the original township. It retained its own police section until the 1960s. The first combined police house and station at Hipperholme was in Roydlands Terrace and was occupied by the section sergeant. This was transferred to a new property in Brookville, Halifax Road in 1911, with the first occupant being Police Sergeant 982 Alexander Kirkbright. Any prisoners would have been initially dealt with at this house before being taken to Halifax. On a cold and wintry morning, after being up all night, I can see how some prisoners might have been encouraged to escape by the arresting officer, so he didn't have to walk them to Halifax over the old Lister Road. In 1927, PC 428 John Roberts, a new recruit who was initially going to be posted to Batley, was told without warning that his posting had been cancelled, and he was immediately given a new posting to Hipperholme. I went to visit John shortly after he celebrated his 100th birthday. At the time of his posting, the area had two serious problems. Firstly, there was a series of burglaries at some of the bigger houses in Lightcliffe. However, by far the most serious problem was the traffic congestion at the Hipperholme crossroads. And now, 88 years later, it is still a problem. During the Second World War, Police Sergeant Tom Denny was the Hipperholme section sergeant. Tom was one of the old school of supervisors, and to his young constables he was the nearest thing to God. What he said was how it was, whether it was right or wrong. You never questioned him. Through the post-war era and into the 1950s, Sergeant 216 Alan Lunn replaced Tom Denny after his retirement. Lunn himself was replaced by Sergeant 529 Albert Edward Chester at the Hipperholme section. In 1955, during the conflict in Cyprus, a United Kingdom police unit was established and Sergeant Chester was seconded there. After completing his service in Cyprus, he returned to his post at Hipperholme. Policing was now gradually changing, and more so after the post-war estates were built. One of the earliest to be erected was Smith House between 1919 and 1921, but the big development was between 1949 and 1953, when most of the Stony Lane estate was built. With the completion of the estates, arrangements were made with the local authority for a number of houses to be occupied by the local police officers. The first police house was on the Smith House estate and was in Smith House Grove. In 1953, PC James Stansfield was appointed as the new Stony Lane estate and Lightcliffe local bobby, and he lived in Cliff Avenue, one of the new streets on the estate. He remained in the area until 1958, but he returned to Brighouse in 1978 as an inspector and served there until his retirement in 1982. I was 3 years old when he first came to Lightcliffe. On my appointment as the local bobby and pounding the same beat as he had done all those years earlier, we often met up and took the opportunity to talk about the old days. Society went through some major changes during the 1960s, which meant the police had to change and modernise as well. The response was to introduce unit beat policing, which came to Brighouse on April the 17th, 1967. Unfortunately, history has shown that this new style of policing did not meet with the overall approval of the general public. One of the key reasons for this was highlighted in a report at the time that indicated the public's perception was that the traditional style of British policing had changed. The more traditional local bobby, who many people remembered from their own childhood, was quickly becoming a thing of the past. Unit beat policing was described as a means of providing a rapid response to calls for police help, promoting good relations with the public and enabling information about crime and criminals to be collated systematically and then retrieved quickly. The new unit beats had area constables who would preserve the long-held tradition of maintaining close relations with the public and local communities. The beat car would provide a faster emergency service, and the local detectives and a collator would analyse information provided by the patrol officers, information which could be then used to help detect crime. These changes were seen as necessary by the late 1960s, with even greater changes taking place in society. For example, the growth in motor transport meant for many that the streets were no longer the playground for local children. In many areas, the attitudes and family lives of the local community were moving away from the traditions of the pre-1960s and early post-war years. Patterns of crime were also changing, with the insurance companies demanding better security for factories and banks. Criminals were turning their attentions to committing offences against many of the new post-war housing developments, and the new motor cars were also a target. Crime was becoming more violent and confrontational. Parental attitudes were also changing, with some parents turning against the local bobby. When one of their children was in trouble, and irrespective of what the young person had done, it was not uncommon for a parent to suggest that their child would not be in trouble if the police had not caught them. Someone who worked at Brighouse when unit beat policing was first introduced was PC 2219 Neville Sharp. In 1967 he was appointed a police dog handler in the West Riding Constabulary, attached to the police dog unit at Sandal, Wakefield. He was one of only 6 dog handlers in the force at the time. When Neville was appointed as a dog handler, he was required to perform his duties with his police dog at Brighouse, a town he had never heard of. During the mid to late 1960s, Brighouse had a reputation as a town of high excitement amongst the younger generation. At Brighouse, the unit was commanded by a chief inspector and 4 inspectors, 1 on each shift, and some 40 police officers. The area was divided into beats that provided boundaries, not serious boundaries, but an outline for officers to be assigned patrol duties on each shift. Every beat within close proximity of the town centre had 1 officer assigned per tour of duty. The surrounding beats, Rastrick, Clifton, Bailiff Bridge, Lightcliffe, Hipperholme and Norwood Green, had a residential beat officer patrolling on foot, working discretionary hours to supplement the town centre officers. Neville recalls that the icing on the cake during this period was the introduction of Pi pocket radios. This was the first 2-way radio system in the force, comprising of a receiving unit and a transmitting unit. The old-style police uniform at that time had not yet caught up with the new way of policing and technology, and did not have any pockets or a belt to attach the new police radio to. Some changes were inevitably made, with each officer being provided with a harness to put the units in and hang around their neck. Each radio unit was powered by a rechargeable battery, and this was a real revolution in communications. The modern-day police officer of the 1960s could talk directly to the police station, receiving immediate messages about occurrences, accidents, fires, officers requiring assistance, general crime information, and details of persons missing or wanted. This was an unbelievable experience, and something many officers never imagined would have happened, all some 20 years before the mobile telephone we know today. Throughout all these changes, the local policeman has been in a unique position. Unlike residents who only see people and places change gradually in their own immediate surroundings, the unit beat officer, the resident constable, and then the community constable have been in a position to see changes taking place throughout the whole community. During the 16 years I served as the community constable, I saw babies grow into teenagers, and teenagers grow up and get married. I observed people getting older and inevitably had to deal with their passing. I dealt with the troublesome teenagers and then saw them grow up into responsible, caring adults. I saw many shopkeepers come and stay a while and others move on. A time came when some policemen would not work in the area that they lived in because it was said that you were always on duty. To me and all the other officers who lived and worked in their home area, that was a price worth paying. Job satisfaction and being part of the community meant a lot.